Hello there, I'm Chris Stashew.
And I'm Mike White.
And I am Father Malone.
And this is Dreams for Sale, the Twilight Zone 1985 podcast. Every month we'll be covering one episode of the series from the 80s, along with some associated ephemera surrounding the show.
The show is a reboot of the 60s classic originally created by Rod Serling, and it features a who's who of notable 80s actors, directors, and scriptwriters.
Well, before we get into the first episode of Twilight Zone 1985, I think it's a little important to give our audience kind of a reason why we're talking about Twilight Zone 85, kind of our experience with the show. I'm going to just come out and say it. I had not seen any of the show prior to the three of us getting together and coming up with the idea to do this. So I'm going to kick it to Mike White first. Mike, why are we talking about Twilight Zone 1985?
Because you guys didn't want to do a Quantum Leap podcast. Fuck you.
And you guys didn't want to do a C-Lab podcast or a SCV or whatever the hell that show was called?
I think it was.
Yeah, you were so into that show. Yeah.
I watched the whole thing, Father Malone.
Oh, you watched what, the whole pilot?
No, I've watched none of it. I deleted it immediately.
We are talking about this one because it is a show on which we all agreed. So that is kind of the way. And then also, because there's a renewed interest in the Twilight Zone, we've got Jordan Peele's new show that will be coming out eventually. I've been hearing about that for a while. And this is not the original Twilight Zone, and I think that has been kind of covered almost to death. So I don't think that this one gets discussed as much as it should, or that, wasn't there just a reboot like 2 years ago of the Twilight Zone 2, but I missed that completely.
I think there was one in 2003 that was with Forrest Whitaker was standing in Rod Serling in that one, and it was beginning to end absolutely dreadful. As for me, now obviously I think we all grew up watching the original Twilight Zone. I was probably 13 when this hit the air. I watched it voraciously. I think in some ways, I like it better than the original run of the Twilight Zone. It's certainly better than the reboot that they tried in 2003. Well, the jury's out on what the Jordan Peele one will be. For me, I think it's fantastic, and for all the reasons we've already sort of discussed, or rather mentioned, that it is a real who's who of the creative going on in the 1980s. I think it's definitely worth another look, and I think it's a show not enough people know about.
Yeah, I saw this when I was also 13 years old. I guess we're right around the same age. This was kind of like, I can't remember when things like Tales from the Dark Side was out, but it feels like it was right around the same time. So it almost felt like a golden age of television telling, spooky tales kind of thing. And I remember watching this. This was on in the evenings on CBS, if memory serves. And
absolutely,
I tuned in every single week. I have never gone back to this show except other than to make references to it on my own podcast and to, talk about things like wordplay or Shadow Man or just like things that have stuck with me for all these years. So I'm very excited to go back and revisit these. So if people are curious, yes, I've seen them before, but I'm going to be talking about them as if I haven't, because it has been since 1985 since I have seen these things.
And talking about another podcast that Father Malone, Mike Willis, and I do together, this show was right before Tales from the Crypt. This show ended the year Tales from the Crypt kicked off. So we have essentially two of the best examples of how to do an anthology TV series the right way, back to back, in the 80s, which is really good for anthology TV series. And it also just, again, kind of cements the legacy of Twilight Zone and being kind of a kind of a generational piece of television and an opportunity for people to tell stories that aren't kind of burdened by the era that they're told in.
Yeah, and I think, with this sort of reimagining of the show, it was a generation who had grown up on it and loved it. I think we're doing it the proper justice. They sometimes hewed a little too close to some of the more smarmy elements of the original series.
I think it was a real mistake using the holographic Rod Serling to introduce and outroduce the episodes, because his mouth never really matched up with the narrator's voice, who was doing a really poor impersonation of Rod Serling. But, other than that, I think that was the biggest misstep on the series.
That's not a thing.
Oh, I must have been watching something else.
I think you're thinking of the Tower of Terror ride at Disneyland that is no longer there.
No, not at Disneyland, but they still have it in Disney World.
That is correct.
What a bummer, though, because they had a really well-done Rod Serling hologram thing. Let's actually talk about Twilight Zone 1985. So we'll play the narrator intro for the first episode, Shatterday, and we'll talk about the episode when we get back.
Some push for what they need. Some push for what they want. Some people, like Peter J. Novins, just push. If they do it hard enough and long enough, something might just push back. From the Twilight Zone.
So, this is the first episode of Twilight Zone 1985. It was split into two stories, Shatterday and A Little Peace and Quiet. This episode aired September 27th, 1985. The first half of the episode, well, both halves of the episode, are directed by Wes Craven. Shatterday is written for the screen by Alan Brenner, based off of the short story by Harlan Ellison. It stars Bruce Willis, who plays Peter J. Novins, who calls his apartment by accident and finds that he answers on the other end. I'm going to give my thoughts initially since I had never seen this before. This is the bar that has been set for this show. Similarly to Tales from the Crypt. I don't know if this is going to end up being my favorite episode of the show, but it is a very impactful, well thought out, and well acted and directed episode. It's almost a perfect 22 minutes of TV.
There's absolutely no fat on this episode. It comes in, it sets it up. Within the first 3 minutes, we are introduced to what the premise of this is. And the use of the title cards to take us through just these few days as the narrative progresses, really well done. And it just, boom, boom, boom. We are right through this. There's no, hey, let's introduce a B plot for no particular reason whatsoever. We just stick with the A plot, and it takes us through this nice narrative. And that it was 22 minutes was surprising because it felt so tight. This felt like it was 10 minutes long, not 22 minutes, just because it moves so quickly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, the word from everyone sort of creatively behind the scenes was always that this was a writer's show. And you can really feel that. It's completely lean, like they sort of trusted in the source material, in this case, Alan Brennan, and just translated it almost verbatim from story to script. Yeah, it is a hell of an opening salvo for a TV series, while at the same time, I think, evoking all the best elements of the original Twilight Zone. It put a new modern stamp on it, while also being a bit reverential to the original material.
And it may be the best thing I've seen Bruce Willis do ever. Maybe not ever, but in a long time. He is... The thing about Bruce Willis now is that he has kind of become Steven Seagal-esque in the projects that he does, where it's just kind of, he just seems to be doing projects for money's sake. He doesn't really seem to care about the quality of them, and he'll hit one or two good ones every now and then. Maybe Steven Seagal's a bad comparison. More Nicolas Cage. And it's interesting to see Bruce Willis in a project like this that is as well done as it is. And it's so un-Bruce Willis in a way that is surprising. Especially for someone my age who didn't grow up with moonlighting Bruce Willis.
Those early Bruce Willis roles, like where he was in more of the wacky comedy kind of things, like especially, what was the Blake Edwards one that he was in with... it was the date night movie. And
Blind Date,
thank you. And he could play this kind of, more sensitive character. And it's nice because we are really getting two performances from Bruce Willis in this, and they are very different, though they kind of literally change places as we're going through here, one becoming more confident, one becoming less confident. And he could have that emotional range before he kind of bought his own hype with the tough guy thing. And yeah, you're right. The Nicolas Cage comparison is 100% appropriate because there are a lot of times where just these Bruce Willis movies will show up on Netflix just like the Nick Cage movies will show up on Netflix, and I'll be like, I've never heard of this before. What could this be? Though so many of them are 100% interchangeable, where it's like, okay, is he a cop in this one or is he a killer? Regardless, he's going to have the same look on his face for the entire movie, which is a shame because I really like Bruce Willis, having experienced those earlier roles and seeing them, and he can still do that on occasion, and he's still making movies, rarely these days, but still making movies that will captivate me, but those are much more fewer and far between.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo what you guys said, basically, but there did seem a time where he always seemed to be stretching as an actor. Like, I think, as you said, Moonlighting was probably everyone's first introduction to him. And that was kind of an smart alecky, sort of comedic character, and he parlayed that into the first couple of films he did until he hit Die Hard, and that was a nice sort of melding of his comedic persona and the action thing. And I think he continued that for a few years afterwards. Now he is 100% just a sort of stoic kind of tough guy character in all of his recent work. In this episode in particular, which I think was I think this was the same year that Moonlighting sort of hit, his character. The sort of one who is slowly fading away, that Peter Novins, displays a level of vulnerability that you rarely ever saw him sort of emote. It was a good performance. And not to mention the sort of more confident doppelganger that shows up. It wasn't the sort of tough guy persona while at the same time being sort of firm and earnest. I think they're both pretty masterful performances from one guy in one episode that I'm sure they didn't have more than a week to film. So it's actually kind of an achievement.
This episode is a lot quieter than a lot of the Twilight Zone episodes, or I guess people's perception of the Twilight Zone. It's a lot more subdued. I mean, when people think of the Twilight Zone, what do they think of? They think of To Serve Man. They think of the episode where the woman is beautiful and everyone is ugly and everyone thinks she's ugly. And then you obviously have the Twilight Zone movie that came out. So a lot of this performance in this episode is a lot more subdued than I was expecting from the first episode of a Twilight Zone show. And I think that works in the show's favor.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't ramp it up and get all too science fiction-y or spooky or it is a very quiet, as you said, a very quiet episode, completely effective. Hats off to Wes Craven for sort of handling the material as delicately as he seemed to.
Yeah, they could have really gotten caught up in the whole idea of when did this split happen? How did it happen? There was an accident in a nuclear power plant or whatever. And it's more like they guess at it in passing rather than that being the first 10 minutes of this episode and oh my gosh, now what's going to happen? This is not Modern Problems. We don't spend the first act of this story, this really tight 22-minute story, having this split occur and then what happens after that. It's really nice that it starts with a mistake and then we go from there.
Yeah, and you know what? If you go back and read the original story, Ellison even throws in a brief conversation between the two characters, how could this have happened? Maybe it was when I had my aura photographed, it could have been that, or it could have been this other thing, and then they both kind of dismiss it. Kudos to Alan Brenner for realizing that no matter what situation was going to be brought up, it doesn't actually matter. The fact is it's happening and the character has to deal with it, which is always the sort of best, in my opinion. Way too often we get into why it occurred as if it's in any way going to satisfy your imagination.
Well, and that was the thing I liked about it, is that it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't matter why this happened. It's more about the struggle between Novins and other Novins. Other Novins being the one that is locked himself inside of his apartment. Or not, locked himself in quotations. And I like that this episode is more about internal struggles with, you could take it a number of ways, really. The way I take it is an internal struggle with good and evil in quotations. It's not really good, it's not really evil, but it's setting your life on the right path and facing the mistakes that you've made and being able to overcome them. But you could also look at it as overcoming addiction, or it can be taken a number of ways, but I like that this episode kind of tackles a really serious topic in a way that works in the scheme and the scope of the episode.
Yeah, it doesn't really pander. I think it allows you to draw your own conclusion, which is always the hallmark of really good fiction. It could be interpreted as this or that or the other thing, but ultimately it's just a good tale well told. So hats off to this first episode. What a good through line for the beginning of the series.
And I do, all kidding aside, I made that joke about the hologram of Serling, and I thought it was really smart that they don't show our narrator on this and that we just allow him to be a disembodied voice who comes in and comes out. And I don't know, obviously this is the first time I've seen this in a long time. I don't know if we're going to do cold open and then introduction, or if we'll start with the introduction and then we'll go off to the races. But, there was always that moment of, when is Rod Serling going to show up? Is he going to be at the beginning? Will they come in? Will the camera pan over and there he is? So that will be lessened by us not actually having a corporeal narrator, and it was a nice way to do that. And then also kind of nice too to pick up some of the theme of the original, but not pander to that with the actual Twilight Zone theme song, and having the Grateful Dead do it was kind of a nice touch as well.
Let's not forget, Charles Aidman does a fantastic job echoing Rod Serling, but not aping Rod Serling.
Yes.
And I think that's a huge success. Like you said, him not being on screen is great, but also evoking the spirit of Rod Serling, but not just doing a Rod Serling ripoff or an imitation, as it were.
Yeah, and I'm sure when the original Twilight Zone came on, I mean, Rod Serling as a personality is fairly magnetic. I think for audiences of the time, it was kind of bizarre television series to suddenly be diving into, and you kind of needed someone to hold your hand through it. And like these guys were smart enough to know that there's no replacing Rod Serling. Nobody who they got would have been able to replicate the charm and personality of the man. Never mind the fact that we ultimately don't need a guy on screen. And it is good to have a narrator. I honestly think they could have done without it, but as far as echoing the original series without aping it, it was a good move.
Well, I mean, they probably didn't need it, but at the same time, if you're going to have a show called The Twilight Zone, that's one of the things that I think you can't get away from, It's like, could you do Tales from the Crypt without the Crypt Keeper? She sure could, but, I mean, that's what it's known for. And when I think of The Twilight Zone from the 60s, I think of Rod Serling on screen. But, again, I think Aidman does a fantastic job of doing that, but not doing it in a way that's distracting either.
Yeah, thank God they didn't choose to mimic him or have some sort of impersonator, like, try and continue it. I mean, I guess they kind of already had done it in the Twilight Zone movie, where they actually got Burgess Meredith, who was in a bunch of the really good original Twilight Zone episodes, to be the narrator. So there was some groundwork already laid for that when they made this series. But Charles Aidman is great, and a great voice. Puts a distinctive stamp on this series.
It feels distinctly 80s with the Grateful Dead, and again with the actors on screen, and also like the topic of the episode and the character of Novins is like a yuppie, kind of like a yuppie business dickhead. That I think it just, everything about this screams 80s, and I like that about the show, that it screams 80s, but at the same time, the subject matter of the episode is kind of universal, and I think that's what makes Twilight Zone a show worth talking about, is because the subject matter, for the most part, is universal, but the setting is very distinct to the era that it was made in.
And it was nice, too, that we didn't have a bunch of superfluous characters running around. I mean, this is really the Bruce Willis story, and we don't need to introduce very many other people into this, so we just kept it. I mean, so much of this episode is two guys who are the same guy talking, and that works.
Chris and I, when we're talking about Tales from the Crypt, like too often an episode seems to want to scream to be a character piece, and then they busy it up with all of these other subplots and machinations. And it's good to see restraint on TV, to actually trust that an audience will appreciate a character piece as it is presented. And I think, again, they did a very masterful job here with this one.
All right, so we'll take a break and we'll play some commercials, and when we get back, we'll have the narrator introduce the next episode. We're going to talk about the second half of the first episode of Twilight Zone 1985. That segment was called A Little Peace and Quiet. It's directed again by Wes Craven, written by James Crocker. It stars Melinda Dillon as a harried housewife who struggles to balance all of the machinations of her life, but then she seems to find something that may be able to help her in the way of like it's like a sundial.
Yeah, it's not really a watch, but it looks kind of like a watch.
I did not like this episode compared to the last one, and I also don't think this episode... I mean, it's very much an episode that feels like it came from the original show because it kind of did. They had a similar episode in the original show, so it felt a little derivative having seen the original show. It's okay, the performances are all right, but I think it was just an okay episode.
Yeah, it kind of mashed up Time Enough at Last and was kind of Stopwatch. Was that the name of that one, Father Malone?
That was absolutely.
Yeah, and
you would push the watch and everything would freeze, and then he broke the watch at the end of the episode.
Yeah, this one, it was one of those, like, once we got the gag of this, that she finds this thing and it allows her to stop time by saying shut up and then go ahead, I guess, is the comeback thing. We only needed to see that happen maybe twice, once to establish it, twice to make it funny, and then the third time to make it scary. But it happens a lot more than that. You know, it happens at her house with the family. Okay, great. Now we see that she can put a stop to the husband and the kids just being these wild animals. We see it with the, Jehovah's Witnesses type characters. I know they're not Jehovah's Witnesses, but we see it there. But then we see it also at the grocery store, and it's just like, okay, yeah, that's at least one too many. We really could have cut this thing back. We didn't have to have two halves to this episode. It really could have been the main story and then just a quick 10-minute follow-up. It did not need to go on this long.
I agree. I think when I initially saw the episode, I liked it a lot more than I did now. It does feel remarkably of the time. This, even more than Shatterday, feels like this is definitely 1985. And it feels like it is striving way too hard to evoke the original Twilight Zone with let's tackle a social issue going on right now. Yeah, not to mention the fact exactly what you just said. We get it. We see what she can do. We don't need to keep seeing her do it over and over again. In some of the later episodes in the series, they would not only have like two 22-minute episodes, but they would have maybe two or three, and some only lasting maybe 10 minutes. And this one kind of cried out for a shorter version. Having said that, I do like Melinda Dillon in it quite a bit. I think she's kind of wildly underrated. I think most people would only recognize her from the mom in A Christmas Story, but she was also great in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I think she's very good in the episode. And I will say also, like, as many problems as I have with the script of it, I think Wes Craven's direction is really good, particularly the sort of the coda when she's walking through town and everyone is frozen because, this is, again, 1985. Those people are just standing there as still as they can, and I think it worked really well.
I noticed they really cut around those kids when they were doing the whole we are frozen in time thing, and they would go back to the husband way more than to the kids, and I was like, yeah, I think the husband can probably handle this a little bit more than the kids can. But I will say, the end of this episode, that final shot of this episode, is one that stuck with me. So all of these years later, we should probably figure out from 85 to 2018 just how many years, because I'm going to keep saying that as we go along. But however many years ago that was, this image stuck with me.
It'll be 33 years.
Yeah, 33 years. And I completely agree with you. Like, as corny as the episode seems now, like, for my young, fertile brain, it definitely, seared that image in. And the possibility of somebody freezing everything in a moment just before a nuclear warhead is about to go off definitely warped me a little bit.
Talking about the episode and it getting to the really impactful coda, it takes so long for her to even get the stopwatch device. And it takes so long for this episode to get going that by the end of it, they give you so much time to kind of not formulate where this is going, but you see this coming, if that makes sense, because they keep talking about the US and the Soviet Union and the rising tension, and so it's like this is where it was going. If the episode had been shorter, they might have been forced to kind of trim around a lot of the unnecessary nonsense that happens in the episode and really just kind of cut to that. And that's the interesting part of the episode. It's not her stealing groceries or like, you know, making fun of the war protest, the war protesters, but they're like people that are trying to inform you about what's going on. And I feel like if this episode had been shorter, it would have been a kind of a more impactful story throughout, as opposed to an impactful coda on a really silly episode. Because the tones don't really match at all.
No, it doesn't feel like they needed to have the sort of harried housewife character and her feeling her way through these powers. It very well just should have begun with a character who can already do this, and then somehow tie that into the ending. Like, you know, watching how tough it is to be a housewife in suburbia, like, didn't pay off in any way with the sort of a grander warfare scheme that was like on its way. Other than maybe they were just trying to make people relate to it, watching from their suburban homes, which I guess worked a little bit. But we also would have benefited from any other character who can already have this power, from beginning to end.
Well, and I think the way they should have done it was they should have had a character who was like a doomsayer, like someone who's paranoid about the war. And so then they're given this item that they can either allow themselves to be destroyed or stop time completely. I feel like that would have been an interesting route to go, because then they're like, well, I've been saying it all along and I had to stop time, but I'm by myself. I think that would have been interesting. Yeah, because the tone of the episode, it's such a 180 that it just doesn't, for me, it doesn't work.
I would have liked to have seen a couple things. Like, one, they start where time has already been frozen, and it's her trying to get maybe from the dark side of the world into the light side of the world. I mean, I don't know if the world is going to keep turning or not, or if everything is completely frozen that way as well. Maybe that's one idea to kind of start us in that time period. Another idea is she freezes time at one point and somebody doesn't freeze, and we get to see that there's somebody who is immune to this effect. I think both of those would have provided this with almost a better twist for the middle of the story, because really the middle of the story, the twist is that she finds the watch, and it really, that she should have found that a lot sooner.
Ultimately, this is not a winning episode. Again, I do like the performances in it. I do like that final image, and I think Wes Craven did a really good job directing it. But ultimately, I could not recommend this to somebody.
It's just okay, but the original episodes from the original series are much better. And that, I think that's also the problem, is that this is so close to those that it's almost just like, go watch those. This one has a really impactful end scene, but everything else in between the beginning and kind of the last couple minutes of the episode, just it doesn't really work.
When people remember the original Twilight Zone, I think too often they bring up the twist. This one is kind of playing on that. But if you go back and watch that original series, like, the ones with the twist occasionally are still great, but more often than not, it's the ones that did not have that sort of moment. It wasn't building towards a pulling the rug out from under you. It was just a good story, well told. You can go back and watch those, and those are great. And this one suffers because the twist isn't exactly fantastic. Rewatching it was kind of a slog.
Yeah, which is a shame. I mean, you mentioned Melinda Dillon, and she is great, and she deserved better than this.
Since we're on the first episode, the credit sequence in this is fucking phenomenal. The sort of intro for the show, the images chosen, the sort of window opening, and coupled with the Grateful Dead's kind of off-kilter hinting at the original Twilight Zone theme. I love this credit sequence. I mean, I enjoyed the original Twilight Zone. They had 3 or 4 actual openings for it, but this one is really strong. Evokes everything that the Twilight Zone has the potential for, that whether it's horror or science or just sort of fantasy elements. I really love it. I can watch it all day.
Well, and again, it does a good job of evoking the original show without making you be like, I'd rather be watching the original show. It evokes it in a good way, not in a pandering way. And I like that.
Right.
And I also really like that it feels, again, when this was made. It feels like the 80s. Everything screams 80s in the intro to the show. And that's awesome.
And yeah, to pick up on your point too, I'm glad that they didn't do the dimension of sight, dimension of sound, all that kind of stuff. Just leave that by the wayside. Let's rely on the images and the music and not have to do the VO for that part, because I think that would have been way too much.
Would have been way too close.
Yeah.
And we're joking about the hologram of Rod Serling, but the briefest glimpse of him, just a flash, is enough to sort of link us to the original as well. Nod without pandering.
They don't need to beat us over the head with the fact that this is Twilight Zone. It's such an iconic TV show that it's part of kind of pop culture, and it's like we don't need to see everything about the original Twilight Zone. Just give us a little twist on it. Give us a little twist, something. And I think they did a really good job, and that's a good thing. And talking about the most recent reboot, that's one of the reasons I didn't like the new one, is because they ape the original too much. So that's why I'm already on board with this show, because they don't make it seem like they're trying to really just go back to the original so much that they can't let the show stand on its own. Which is so far one of the things I've enjoyed about this show the most. All right, well, so on the next episode of Dreams for Sale, we're going to be talking about episode 2 of season 1 of Twilight Zone 1985. That episode is broken into 3 segments. We're going to be talking about wordplay, Dreams for Sale, the eponymous episode for which this podcast is named, and Chameleon. I am looking forward to those because I have heard nothing but good things about wordplay and Dreams for Sale.
And Chameleon, as a matter of fact. Talk about a way to come out the gate and really stick it to the audience. Episode 2 is going to be fantastic.
And I cannot wait. Until then, where can people find you, Mr. Mike White?
They can find me over at the Kolchak Tapes, kolchaktapes.com, which is something that we do once a month, talking about another older spooky TV show, though a little older than this one by about 11 years. And they can also find me at the Projection Booth, which is projection-booth.com, which is a weekly movie show that I've been doing for a little while.
What about you, Mr. Wallace?
You can find me. I have a YouTube channel called Hot 5 Films, where I have a show called You've Never Seen, where I sort of reintroduce or introduce audiences to movies that have kind of fallen by the wayside or never got their due to begin with. I am also the co-host with you, Chris, of Chronicles from the Crypt, another podcast where we take on the HBO television series based on the original EC comics from the late 80s, early 90s.
And you can follow me on Twitter at Culture Stash. And if you want to hear me talk about movies, head on over to culturecast.com to check out my podcast, The Culture Cast, where I am joined by these two fellas sometimes my co-host Eric, where we talk about new movies and genre films, pretty much. So make sure to check that out. If you want to find the feed for this podcast, head on over to twilightzone85.com, where you can find out more information about the show. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, we are over at TwilightZone85. So make sure to check out the next episode.